and welcome to Deakin Edge at Fed Square for this evening's Melbourne Conversations discussion, After Russell Brand, Making Democracy Work Better for You. I respectfully acknowledge that we are gathered here on the traditional land of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. My name is Dr. Leslie Canold, and I'm your host. I want to welcome also our distinguished panel, Nicholas Rees, Maria Katsonis, Travis McLeod, and our special Skype guest, Samar Hadid, who's in Lebanon and who we'll be doing a cross with shortly on Skype. Now, one of the aims of this evening is to provoke you to create and contribute ideas to assist in the refresh of Future Melbourne, a community vision plan first written by the community of the City of Melbourne in 2008. To start this update, we are inviting you to share your big ideas on the Future of Melbourne 2026 website and join the conversation by commenting on the 100 plus big ideas already suggested. Now let's talking about the event. In the conversation last year, political scientists Mark Triffitt and Travis McLeod, who's one of our guests tonight, argued that the least obvious crisis of the 21st century is that of democratic governance. At the same time as people in the Middle East continue to cry out for basic transparency, honesty, and representation in government, just over half of young Australians are telling pollsters that they're not confident that democracy is preferable to any other kind of government. More worryingly, 26% of Australian youth aged 18 to 29 believe it doesn't matter what government we have. So if you're wondering what such deep and profound disillusionment sounds like, look no further than the pointed comments of Russell Brand, the 45-year-old English comedian, actor, radio host, social activist, and author. Brand writes as follows, and I'm quoting him. He writes, "I fervently believe that we deserve more from our democratic system than the few derisory tidbits tossed from the carousel of the mighty when they hop a few inches left or right. The lazily duplicitous servants of the city expect us to gratefully participate in what amounts to little more than a political hokey-pokey, where every 4 years we get to choose what color tie the liar who leads us wears. We are living in a time of huge economic disparity and confronting ecological disaster. This disparity has always been, in culture since expired, a warning sign of end of days. In Rome, Egypt, and Easter Island, the incubated ruling elites destroyed their societies by not sharing." So in a nutshell, this critique of democracy can be summed up something like this. Across the globe, democratic governance systems are at risk of losing sight of their purpose, the very purpose that gave rise to their existence and led our forebears to pick up arms and to even die for this system of governance. That purpose was the animation of the will of the people, not just some of the people, but all of the people. As a consequence, too many democratic governance systems represent the will of the few, who directly or by proxy rule in their own interest and at the expense of everyone else. Now, it goes without saying that not everyone agrees with Russell Brand. Interestingly, this includes Johnny Linden of the Sex Pistols, who described Brand's advice to avoid voting as, quote, "the most idiotic thing I've ever heard." But tonight's forum is not about angst, and it's not about despair. It's about hope and innovative ideas for the future. It's not about Brand or Linden, but what is needed to make democracy work better for you. How can we revitalize and refresh Australian democracy and advance democracies so they can better tackle the diabolically complex and wicked problems that the 21st century has to offer? Problems like climate change and tax. How will such solutions apply to places in the world that have never known democracy at all? Where do digital communication tools of the 21st century, those we have and those yet to come, fit into this story? To help us answer these questions, I have 4 guests with different but complementary ideas about how we can refresh and innovate democratic governance structures for the 21st century so that everyone has equal access, so that they serve the public interest, so that they are fit for the purpose of solving complex 21st century problems, and so citizens can trust them. For some of our guests, the problems and solutions are inescapably bound up with processes like transparency or with tools like digital technology. Others support a selective return to the direct democratic participatory mechanisms begun in ancient Greece. But I'm spoiling. So without any further ado, let me introduce my first guest to the stage. Can we please welcome Travers McLeod? Now, Travers is a bit of a boy wonderkind. He's the Chief Executive Officer of the Centre for Public Policy Development. He's worked as a policy advisor for the Oxford Martin School at the University of Oxford. He's been an associate to High Court Justice Michael Kirby, and just in his spare time, he was a Rhodes Scholar. So I'm going to ask him a few questions, and then we'll get some of the other guests to come up. Hello.
Hello.
Hello. Welcome.
I fear you know my material better than I do in that introduction.
Well, that's good.
Certainly know
that's
Russell
good.
Brand.
Yeah. So, Travers, 1 in 4 young Australians are not enrolled to vote. I mean, we heard all the statistics I read out at the beginning, which are statistics I know that you know. We've already mentioned that poll, which found that less than half of Australian youth think democracy is preferable to any other kind of government. Now, you argue that young people's disengagement is a symptom of the problem and not the problem itself. So what's the problem?
I think the problem is, I'll offer a caveat in a moment, but I think the problem is that our democratic system as it presently exists might not be fit for purpose. And that's not to say we do away with democracy, far from it. But Australia's successful and stable democracy has been built very much on prior glories and successes. And whether it's fit for the purpose of meeting 21st century challenges, I think, is an altogether different question. And just some examples. So you mentioned less than, I think it's 1 in 4 young Australians aren't enrolled to vote. So between 18 and 25, only 74% of registered or eligible voters are registered. It gets worse if you're 18. If you're 18, it's under 50%. Only 47% of those eligible are registered. And it's not about voting either, it's also about membership of political parties. There are more members of the MCC down the road, the Melbourne Cricket Club, and, believe it or not, of the Australian Historical Federation of Societies, than there are of all of our political parties, or our leading political parties, the Greens, the ALP and the Liberal National parties combined. So there's something about this disengagement from the system. And successful democracies are stable, but they're not static. And the point I was making in that material you referred to is that to be fit for purpose for 21st century challenges, just as we have changed dramatically from the democratic system that we had 100 years ago, we have to think about non-path dependent changes to the system that we have right now.
And what is it about the 21st century that is posing such different challenges that make the system, as you say, that we developed 100 years ago, not fit for purpose now?
I think, well, you alluded to one of them, which is hyperconnectivity. If 100 years ago, during the First World War, events outstripped communications during the July crisis of 1914, in this day and age, communications are often outstripping events. And the issues that we're grappling with, be it climate change, inequality, geopolitical shifts to our region, they are issues that can't be easily compartmentalised into jurisdictions or into neat governmental boxes. They're as interdependent as the countries responding to them and the communities responding to them. So whereas previously we might have been happily putting a nail into a round hole, we might be making incremental changes to our system of democracy, like citizen juries and deliberative democracy, without actually looking at our political institutions and wondering whether they are fit for the sorts of challenges that they're now facing, which cross borders, cross governments, and the longer term ability of the institutions to adapt, I think there's a big question mark over whether they are adapting fast enough.
Well, I definitely want to get back to citizens' panels and those kind of interventions. But one of the things that I read was that the way government was set up was much more, back in the day for things that governments actually had to deal with were more predictable processes, things that we understood would happen, and then we had a whole bunch of systems to manage it. Is what's going on now is that we, in some ways, not able to predict so well, or is it the problems are too complex, or is it a combination of both?
It's a bit of box A and a bit of box B. I think part of it is that the challenges have non-linear consequences, and they don't present burning crises where you have an instant reaction as we have in the past. Take climate change. When Mark and I are writing about that, a lot of the consequences are non-linear. They will be exponential, but we can't necessarily see them right now, but they will get worse the longer we wait. The problem is Australia can't solve it alone, and in fact it has to work in concert with others. If you actually do the math, you could probably do more on climate change with 40 big cities and 30 big companies than you might do with 20 governments, depending on which governments they are. So the sites of change and of progress aren't so simple.
Necessarily within government.
Within governments exclusively, there are hybrid forms, but also the fact that so many of the challenges straddle borders.
And let's go back to where we started with young people. So does everybody feel this sense of concern? Why is it that young people in particular, the polls are showing and the behaviours are showing, are particularly frustrated about this?
Part of it is a success story of democracy itself. I mean, last century democracy was probably one of the biggest success stories. When the US entered the First World War to make the world safe for democracy, you saw following that, explosion of democracies around the world, a far more stable set of international relations. And as Steven Pinker has written, the sort of Better Angels of Our Nature, his book, we're far safer as a global society than we have ever been. So success, makes us, I suppose, ready to jump at shadows for challenges that might not be as pressing. But also, Australia is one example of a country that thought a long way ahead on some of the intergenerational challenges that were ahead of it. Floating the dollar, the intergenerational reports, a whole bunch of sort of macroeconomic and societal changes. I think the frustration of young people today, and you see the petitions on change.org and you see all the advocacy movements, often they're not leading to co-production of policy or policy change. And 3 examples of that...
Wait a minute, back up. Co-production of policy, I don't know what that means.
So co-production is, I suppose, where the citizens' juries is an example of one where it's not just elites within governments or parliaments that are producing policy. They're doing it in concert with the citizens, their constituents, and civil society stakeholders.
And what happens when things aren't co-produced? What's the bad outcome of that? Do you get disengagement? I mean, is that where the problems are coming because people don't feel engaged unless they're co-producing policy? Is that a new expectation, or have people always expected that?
Co-producing is probably the wrong word. I think people want to feel like they're influencing policy and not just at the ballot box, that their opinion matters not just in polling reactions to policy proposals, but actually in developing and diagnosing the problems that have to be solved.
So they don't just want to have their say voting every 4 years or 3 years. They want to be more involved in what's happening around things that affect their lives?
Well, I think the statistics are showing the opposite, that they're less involved, they're less engaged. That doesn't mean that there aren't a sizable number of young Australians that are trying to advocate for change. It's just that often those advocacy movements are stymied. And some of the big reforms that we have seen announced on the future of the Federation, the future of tax, even a longer-term white paper on defence, all of those things that were announced almost 3 years ago, those white papers, 2 of them have been shelved and 1 of them we're still waiting for. So the transmission belt of ideas and advocacy into longer-term policies for the country, I think the transmission belt has stalled, and that forces us to ask, well, is the system responding to the right ideas, the best ideas, and translating them into policies on the ground?
And is the lack of involvement that people don't want to be involved, or they're feeling like there's not outcomes that make them feel it's worth being involved, or they're not being invited to be involved?
I think there's certainly a level of frustration and perceived impotence at the inability to move the system. But I think that's not just a problem experienced by young Australians. I think, Australians of all generations. The one thing I'll say in sort of attacking my own argument, though, the turnout in Iowa at the Iowa caucuses in the US a couple of weeks ago was, I think, 13.7% of registered voters. In New Hampshire, it was much bigger, it was 60%. Australia's got a very vibrant, successful democracy. Look at forums like this, Plan Melbourne, which this and other sort of online fora are influencing. So I think we have to be very aware of how lucky we are to be in this sort of country and how stable and vibrant our democratic structures are. But our cautionary note is that if we rest on our laurels and don't think, how can we do this better? How can the transmission belt be improved, transformed? We may see the problems getting ahead of us.
Slip backwards.
That's right.
Okay, fantastic. Look, I'm going to invite Nicholas to join us. So Nicholas, come on up. Nicholas is the Principal Fellow of the School of Social and Political Sciences and the Melbourne School of Government at the University of Melbourne. He was a senior aide to former Australian Prime Minister Julia Gillard and political advisor to Victorian Premiers Steve Bracks and John Brumby. And he's also worked as a lawyer, a journalist and Labor Party secretary in your spare time. So good to have you up here, Nicholas. So I'll start by asking the first question. You've written that you think the proof of the pudding that advanced democracies are no longer fit for purpose is their inability to handle hard problems like climate change, or to take an example closer to home, tax reform. Tell us about that.
Well, let's start with the second example there. I mean, the last major economic reform, or the last major reform we saw in Australia, which was contested, which has stuck, was probably the GST changes back in 2000. So it's, now 16 years ago. If you think about other reforms which have happened since, say like the introduction of a price on carbon, it's been overturned. Nothing that has been contested has stuck since. And to pick up Travis's point earlier, I mean, countries that don't reform, countries that don't make progress will wither and die. And our political system really seems to be struggling to make those big and difficult reforms.
But could that just be simply proof that people turned out they didn't think it was a good idea? Or that people would disagree, 50% think it should be this way, and that's why you get this inability to move forward, because people are honestly divided?
Well, it could well be, but I mean, you look at examples of other democracies around the world and you see that while they certainly have their share of problems, they do seem to have been making advances in policy areas that once upon a time Australia would have led the world in. So, I mean...
So what's going wrong with Australia? What's particularly not happening?
Well,
here? That's
the really big question that I think we've got to unpackage tonight. I mean, let's start with history. I mean, once upon a time, Australia led the world in democratic reform and led the world in terms of major policy developments as well. Manning Clark talks about Australia having had two bites at democracy. The first was back in the 1850s when the colonial parliaments were set up. They were remarkable democratic institutions by the standards of the day. The second bite at democratic reform he talks about was around the 1890s when you saw the emergence of the suffragette movement and Australia becoming a federation. Now, off the back of the suffragette movement, we saw South Australia give women the vote and allow them to stand for Parliament in 1895. It was the first jurisdiction in the world.
So we were innovators.
We were. It wasn't until after the First World War that many countries gave the vote to women. So we were literally 2 decades ahead of the rest of the world. Similarly with our federation, our national parliament. At that point in time, we led the world. Problem being, we haven't really done much for the last 110 years. And as a result, in my view, we now have a system which is not fit for purpose. It's no longer able to get difficult things done.
Because you have to keep working on it. I mean, that seems to be what Travis is saying too, that democracy doesn't just sit there and work. You have to keep moving and innovating and moving it forward. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. I mean, I think firstly we shouldn't be hoping for a better class of politicians. That would be a fruitless hope. What we need to do is design a better system, and we also need to create a better democratic culture in this country. At the end of the day, culture trumps strategy, and I think if we can help build a democratic culture like we had back in the 1850s, like we had in the 1890s, then we will get a better system.
And let's go back, because I know that you're really interested in this issue of people's panels. So Travis mentioned people's panels and other kinds of innovations. So what sorts of things do we need to do to re-engage people co-create, I love that term, I'm going to use it now forever, co-create democracies and move things forward so that we are innovators again?
The first thing I'd suggest, Leslie, is a broad point, and that is we need to start experimenting. You know, we know that some things we try are not going to work. Some will most certainly fail. And so we need to start trying some new things, some new ways of collective decision making. And there's some ideas out there that I think, you know, are worth giving a go. One, which you've just alluded to, is the idea of citizen juries. These have been tried in, you know, over 40 jurisdictions around the world now. One, probably the most notable example in Australia, was the Melbourne People's Panel, which was
right here in
run by
Melbourne.
Melbourne City Council last year. A brave move, I would say, by the City of Melbourne. They should be congratulated for it. University of Melbourne was delighted to be the academic partner. What did they do? You know, in a nutshell, they essentially helped develop a 10-year plan for this city, working through, you know,
so this
taxes,
was people,
expenditure.
just take people through it who don't know anything about it. So this were people who were selected from the community, representative of the different groups in the community, who were brought along, and they were provided with expert briefings and information and all the facts they needed to make a good and informed decision, and basically trusted to make one.
That's exactly right, Leslie. I mean, we used essentially quite a sophisticated stratified random sampling technique to draw together 43 people who were, if you like, a mirror image of the City of Melbourne. They spent 6 weekends working through receiving briefings from city councillors and from experts. And then at the end of that period, they were asked to essentially develop a plan for the City of Melbourne.
And what did they decide?
Well, it was, you know, could a group of ordinary citizens asked to make difficult trade-offs, faced with complex financial information, come to a landing? Absolutely they could.
But that raises the counterfactual, though. You said beforehand that we shouldn't expect more from political leaders, or at least the quality to change. And individually, I'm sure they're of immense quality. So it must be something about the system that sucks that collective quality out of them. You don't seem to have much hope for that changing. Is there any disruptive change to that system so that you could reach similar outcomes, consensus outcomes, to the citizen jury approach?
That's a really good question. I mean, one of the interesting things about a citizen jury is what you find is if you take a group of ordinary citizens and you give them, most importantly, the time to work through a policy issue and get to grips with the trade-offs that are involved in making a decision. You know, for example, spending money on one thing means that you can't spend money on another thing if you're going to balance a budget. And you give them the necessary information, they're actually very good at working it through.
So why don't we do it all the time? I mean, isn't this the answer? Why isn't everyone going, Eureka, this is the answer? Let's do citizens' panels for all our important decisions, and the government can enable what citizens want.
Well, look, I think the citizen jury experiment, and it's still being sort of worked through, shows that they work well in certain circumstances, but perhaps not in others. Citizens are very good at, I think, helping to make high-level decisions. So, for example, in the case of the Melbourne People's Panel, you know, they made some really interesting decisions about where savings could be found in the city budget. They made some really interesting decisions about where new taxes could be raised. For example, they said that developer charges should be lifted in this city to bring them more in line with Sydney and Brisbane. They made some interesting decisions around infrastructure.
And so what wouldn't they be so good at? Like where would the problems be?
Well, look, I still think you need legislators and council members to work through the minutiae of policy making. At the end of the day, that is quite an arduous task. I mean, if you look at the Australian Parliament last year, you know, there was literally hundreds of votes that were held on bills that went through the Parliament. You know, the idea of turning up every night and having to make, you know, hundreds of decisions or many decisions, it's exhausting just thinking about it. Most people are just struggling to get from one end of the week to the other. So let's leave it to professional legislators, if you like, to work through the detail. But on some of those bigger matters of, say, principle or broad direction, then I think citizen juries actually work very well, and that's how it worked in the City of Melbourne.
And the City of
People's Panel.
Melbourne, and we've seen it in South Australia. So is this a wave, or do we need particularly brave politicians to take this on? What's the jeopardy for the political class around this? Because clearly Melbourne City Councils are willing to take it on.
Look, my view is actually there's quite a lot of upside there for the politicians. We surveyed the jury members who were involved in the Melbourne People's Panel, and we found that there was a political dividend there for, Robert Doyle, Stephen Mayne and the other councillors. We asked them at the start of before they began the journey, what did they think of Melbourne City Council? Did they think the city was heading in the right direction? At the end of the 6 weeks, we asked them the same question, and we found that their confidence and belief in the efficacy of council was much higher. So as a result of going through this process, they had more belief in the system.
So that's really interesting, isn't it? So in other words,
Absolutely.
If you give people some engagement and involvement in the system, exactly what you're saying, and let them feel that something is happening and they're creating it, co-creating, that makes them feel better about governance in general.
Absolutely.
Because they're more informed and they're more involved.
The second, I think, quite profound finding was that when we asked people, are you more likely to have confidence in a decision that is made by government which has been the subject to a citizen jury review process, we found that there was a significant uptick in support. And if you think about it, there's a common sense reason for that. If a person knows that a government decision has been made off the back of a recommendation made by a group of ordinary citizens just like you and me who have had the time and the information to work it through, they're going to say yes, they're going to have more confidence in that sort of decision made by government. Now that means, I think, for Australian governments, they should really think about using citizen juries as a way to give them political cover to do brave and difficult, help them make brave and difficult policy decisions.
Can I ask might be a dangerous question because of your former employment, but I liked what you said about the dividend that comes from showing that you're consultative and that it providing cover to do something brave. In 2010, during the election campaign, Prime Minister Gillard announced and I was out of the country, so I was following it from afar, but she announced a citizen panel on climate change that would convene after the election and feed up policy proposals to the federal parliament. And so far as I saw it, that idea was lampooned partly because it was seen as the parliament shirking its responsibility to govern and as a delaying tactic rather than actually making a decision as the elected parliamentarians
And that's
should
interesting
do.
because that was a criticism that was also made of the City of Melbourne when it went to the People's Panel process, that a couple of the conservative forces in the city said, that's your job, why aren't you doing it? It's costing a lot of money, and why aren't you doing it? That's what you were elected to do. So what do you think the answer is to that?
So the decision to have a citizen jury type arrangement to help reach a consensus around carbon pricing as a way of tackling climate change was a decision that was made in the heat of an election campaign. I can say that because I was there. Labor knew that the election was going to go absolutely down to the wire, and that proved to be the case. It also knew that the Liberal National Party, led by Tony Abbott, was coming at them with a huge scare campaign around carbon pricing. And so a decision was made to, and if you go back and look at the words carefully that was said at the time, a decision was made that would be use a citizen panel to help reach a consensus about putting a price on carbon. Now, that was going to involve 150 people meeting at Parliament House, working through it. And as it got announced, people sort of heard that and thought 150 people meeting at Parliament House, that sounds like our Parliament. What's the Parliament's job? It got lampooned from the get-go, and it turned out to be a flop.
I agree with you, though. That's very interesting because it seems like in some contexts people are really thinking that's a great idea, and in other contexts there's pressure against it. So is it something about local government being a more suitable place for people's panels, but federal government not, or what's the secret
look,
here?
I do think local government does lend itself well to citizen jury people panel type arrangements, just by virtue of the sorts of issues they deal with, but just because of the problems that 2010 experience in the federal election, I don't think we should rule them out at a federal level. So, for example, we are due to have a referendum around Indigenous recognition in this country. I would suggest that would be a good thing to put to a people's panel ahead of it going to a national vote. And you could have that people's panel perhaps produce, a one-page summary of its findings around the proposed word. And I would think that if the rest of Australia, when they go to vote on that question, could read a one-page report from a group of people just like them who'd spent a lot of time looking at this thing, I think you're much likely to get a better result as a result.
It would be great. Okay, so look, that's fantastic. I'm going to get Maria to join us. Now, Maria is... I have too much papers up here. Maria Katsonis is the Director, Equality in the Department of Premier and Cabinet. She is a Public Policy Fellow at the Melbourne School of Government, University of Melbourne, a mental health advocate, and author of the wonderful Tell-All autobiography, which I have just found out has been picked up in the UK by a small indie publisher, so rush out and get your copies now. The wonderful Tell-All autobiography, The Good Greek Girl. So thanks, Maria.
Thank you.
Now, Maria, it's sometimes argued that the future for democratic governance lies in governments being enablers or implementers, and I feel like that's something that kind of Nick was talking a little bit about, was this idea that maybe that isn't such a good idea because you need professional politicians who actually really slog through the legislation. But in other places, people have been saying, well, why don't we let the people in a more direct way, now that we've got technology, we don't need representative democracy anymore, we can have direct participation by everybody, telling us what we think about certain issues, and the people will decide, and then it'll be enabled by a cadre of, governance bureaucrats, that kind of thing. People like you. That's right. Is that a good idea? Do you like that idea?
Look, I think it raises multiple issues. The whole issue about consultation, whether consultation is done through 21st century means such as new technology, whether it's done through people panels, whether it's done through the old-fashioned way of I'm going to put a submission in to a discussion paper. And for me, it comes down to the power dynamic between the decision maker and the people the people who are contributing to the consultation. So the question, I think, becomes: is government, whether it be the decision maker, we'll call it generic government for the moment, actually going to listen? Is it simply about getting information? Is it about empowering and allowing people to decide, as you may do in the case of people panels? So I think it's more than just about the tool and the technology. It's about the power dynamic between the people who are being consulted or being asked to contribute and the people who are fundamentally making the decisions.
And do you think if people were given the opportunity... Actually, I'll just ask the audience, I'm just kind of curious. If somebody put to you that we were going to live in a country that from now on all the major policy decisions would be made by you in this imaginary system I've just made up, where you can vote via your computer or your mobile phone. Okay, I just made that up, it doesn't really exist. But let's pretend it does. You could make all the major decisions and governments, the different levels, would just implement them. Who thinks that's a good idea? Oh, okay.
You've just done me out of a job.
Yeah. Not really. It's not as many as I thought. So just so I get the hands on the other side. Sorry? I was about to say, who thinks it's not a good idea? Okay, so I would say that slightly more people think it's not a good idea. So maybe I'll get you guys to have a guess. What's the for case? So the people who thought it was a good idea, what do you think's in their mind? And when we do questions, you guys you can tell me exactly what was in your mind. But let's have a guess.
I think it's about it being ideas and contributions being unmediated, about kind of like the raw information being put on the table and not necessarily being played towards a preconceived agenda, as in the decision's already been made. This is purely consultation for consultation.
So it engenders trust because people
That's
think,
right.
we're really making the decision. This isn't being put out to us in a faux consultation way. We really, and that's what you were talking about. So it's along the power lines of total empowerment. You decide, we will implement. So in that situation, that's what people
right. But
like.
that also assumes that the people making the decisions have got not perfect information, but are coming off a base of information and expert knowledge that equips them to make the decisions. Now, I looked at some of the research and the evaluation around the People's Panel, and what really impressed me was that you just didn't put however many people you had on the jury in a room and let them decide on the budget, that they actually were given some financial and budget literacy. So they had a base level of information and knowledge in order to make those decisions. And I think that's important as well.
So what you would worry about, and perhaps what our no people were worried about, is that you would have lots of people participating in decisions, but they wouldn't be equipped the way they would need to be to make an informed and a good decision. Is that what we're worried about?
I think it depends on the issue and the time frame. I think, Nick's example before about 2010, probably right idea, wrong issue. If it's designed to diagnose a problem and construct pathways for responding to it over a longer horizon, then I think that consultative listening transmission belt is wonderful. The reason why I was encouraged when more people put up their hands against the idea is that the reason why we elect decision makers in some respects is to prevent the tyranny of the majority, to fight for unpopular ideas. And if you look at some of the actions on all sides of politics recently, it's often been to respond to majority opinion on what are deeply unpopular but necessary reforms.
So for instance, in the South, in the United States, the majority would have been in favour of slavery for quite a long time.
Yeah, I mean, gun control's another one.
That's an example. I mean, people might have heard of the Pirate Party and these raft of internet parties which have sprung up, particularly in South America. And as a sort of political scientist, they're quite fascinating. I mean, what they do is they say, if you vote for us, we will truly vote along the way you tell us to, based on online polls that we'll run on our party website. So, the Internet Party of Argentina will, put up what the bills are coming up in Parliament the next day. You vote on them. If you're a member of the party, you get to vote overnight, and then the next day they will vote according to who won the poll the night before. Now, I don't know that that's necessarily going to deliver the best decisions for that country, for that society. I can see some actually quite dangerous things that could come out of that. It's also interesting, some countries are experimenting with crowdsourcing of legislation. So, for example, in Finland, they've started trying that. And you'd have to say it's met with mixed success. So I think...
So could you back up just a minute and explain? So crowdsourcing of legislation, what do you mean by that?
So the basic idea in Finland is that if 50,000 people sign a petition that a particular proposal should go before the Parliament, then under the Finnish constitution, the Parliament must consider and vote upon that. Now, they've had so far 7, but that started in 2012. This is an example of countries starting to experiment what I'm saying we should be doing here in Australia.
Yeah.
Some things will work, some things won't. They started this in Finland in 2012. They've had 7 go forward so far. 6 of them have failed. 1 of them has got through. The one that got through, does anyone want to guess? Marriage equality. Over 50,000 people said we want the Parliament to have a vote on this. Went up, got through. But 6 have failed.
And what do you think that tells us? Why is it so bad that it goes up for... Is that what you were about to ask?
No, I was going to say, let's not diss crowdsourcing. I know you're not, but is crowdsourcing appropriate, which is the wisdom of the crowd? Can we harness the wisdom of the crowd? Is that appropriate, say, for legislation, or can it be used more effectively? So, for example, there is, in the US state government has got a website where it crowdsources solutions to intractable problems by putting up incentives. So someone like Department of Health can say, putting $100,000 on the table for someone who can assist us to solve the problem of how we can reduce this particular rate of infection within the hospital system. Sort of saying that the best people don't necessarily work for you, but that expertise might reside outside of our organisation. Now, in that instance, crowdsourcing, I think, is appropriate, but the question is, when it comes to something like crafting legislation, is that where you do want the expertise in the hands of the legislators who have been, democratically elected for that particular
And it's very
purposes?
it's extremely innovative, isn't it?
That's right.
And it's about governance, even though it's not the headline stuff. Because before I go to Samar, because I'm about to do that, I just want to pick up on that idea of leadership. Because I think when we think about politics, we generally don't think so much about all of the supporting procedures behind the elected officials. We're mostly thinking about leaders, and then, as you say, we're mostly expressing our frustration and dissatisfaction with leaders. But I think you're all kind of suggesting that that's not so much where we should focus. But I wonder, is that human nature? Like, do we as humans want to follow someone? If we like them, do we want them to lead us? So are we ever going to be able to get out of that?
I think we all are crying out for a sort of a vision and leadership for the country that can knit together some more effective solutions to insoluble problems. I think it's partly about creating the necessary conditions for good leadership to thrive. Federally we've got 3-year terms. It means you're effectively governing for 12 months. The 3 big reform papers that this government, the Abbott and then the Turnbull government have put up, 2 of them have now been shelved because there's just not enough time. So I think you need to create the conditions, and whether it's longer electoral periods, whether it's picking a bunch of issues as Finland does, and a committee for the future that's drawn from both sides of the political spectrum can take a longer horizon, consult with the community and develop sort of responses to them over a longer period. It is about good leadership, but you need the conditions for that to actually prosper. And right now I don't think the system has enough of those conditions or makes the most of those good ones that exist.
So are we of a view, because when I was mentioning this forum to somebody who I worked with the other day, that they said exactly that. I said it's about, democratic governance and how we can make it work better for us and how we can innovate around it. And he went, the leaders we've got today are just, no, they're just no good, and that's the problem. And I just thought that's really interesting, because I just wonder if it's human nature in some ways to focus on the face and the person. We are humans and we look for leaders. So what are the conditions, just to follow up on what you were saying, what are the conditions that create good leaders? Because in some ways I wonder if as humans we need them. Even though all this backstory has to be right too, we also need good people who are supported to come to the head of the thing.
Well, that's a huge question. I'm happy to leap in first and probably say some silly
You've
things.
Got a minute,
others.
Right.
So look, I would start by saying that I would posit that it has ever been thus that humans have complained about their leaders. And if you look at, when people think back who have been the great leaders in history, often they are people who have come forward in points of crisis. And when humans all band together because they're facing a shared crisis. And I think that reveals something that, in moments when we really need leadership and humans come together, that's when you'll tend to see good leaders. The flip side of leadership, of course, is followership. I think there's something to be explored there. I mean, as citizens, should we just blindly follow our leaders? I would say no. I think we should be active participants in our society. We should participate in public forums like this. We should turn up to community debates. We should, make our voices heard. In following our leaders, I think, we need to be active citizens. And I think that's really important. I alluded at the start to the importance of a democratic culture, and I think that's something we really need to work on as a country.
And I think it's the other institutions that sit in and around it as well. If you go back to some of the reforms that were raised earlier, whether it be the floating of the dollar, for example, and the kind of leadership we were looking at 20 or 30 years ago, it was operating under very different circumstances. It was not operating under the spotlight of the 24-hour media cycle. It was operating in a time where we valued long-form journalism and informed debate. You fast forward 30 years and it's almost like the leadership contest at the political level. It's become a popularity contest. It's about the influence, and Nick's probably better qualified than me to speak about this given his time in politics, but it's about the influence of poll-driven politics, about the influence of the 24-hour media cycle and the immediate soundbite about how we debate substantive issues at the moment that have a significant influence on our country, such as the current tax debate as well.
So in some ways, the changes we've been talking about might take pressure off, because it's always been the case that politicians need to touch base with the electorate. They need to touch base and connect with the people who are giving them legitimacy, voting for them, putting them where they are. So in a world in which that connection starts to be run through polling, we all kind of can see where some of the problems come. So if we've got other systems, and what kind, where politicians can know what their constituents think, do we get around that problem of putting undue pressure on leaders, do you think?
I mean, I just want to pick up on what Maria said about leaders can come from unusual spaces, right? And they need not come from the Parliament. In England at the moment, you've got the Governor of the Bank of England and his chief economist who are making the case for business and central banks doing a lot more on financial risk because of climate change and climate resilience and longer term reporting cycles and that sort of thing. One idea I'll flag for discussion later, because I'd be keen to know what the group thinks of it, is there's a certain homogeneity of leaders that go into political life in Australia. You know, lawyers, mostly men, mostly white. And I like the idea of appointing some people from outside the parliament as ministers like they do in other countries. You know, why not have Maria as Minister for Service Delivery, or
I'll vote for her.
Rosie Batty, Minister of Women, but you've got experts at the top of their game who have very few incentives to go into politics. And I think part of what we've seen over the last decade is an ignorance of facts and a sort of a scarce expertise at what are very complicated challenges. And why not have a quota of ministers appointed from outside for their specific expertise?
Which is that to some degree, what we need is more mixing between the community and the leadership, whereas at the moment we've got much more kind of, yes?
And I'd add people like me in there who some would call the policy elite.
Sorry,
right?
say that again?
The policy elite. It's not just about the leaders, because you think about how are decisions made in government, and how is advice sought, and who influences and who informs. And so, you know, someone who's going to make a decision is going to take advice from a variety of sources. You look at the current debate on tax reform at the moment. You've got the influence of, say, the policy elite like Treasury, but you've also got the business lobby, whether it's the Business Council of Australia, the social lobby through the Social Council of Services.
So the so-called vested interests.
Yeah, you've got vested interests within there, and you might say that I am a vested interest to a certain extent as well. So the question is, how do you get the balance between, you know, the elected representatives, the stakeholders, the policy elite, the bureaucrats, and also the community in that kind of balance? And I think that's where we're looking to, that's where I think the future is, and that's where I think hope is, because the question is democracy as an institution flawed, or is it how we're using democracy as an institution and its performance?
Or does it need to just keep growing and developing, because this world is changing and growing and developing? So it's the 21st century now. It was developed in the 19th. We need to take the institutions and move them forward, not because the idea is bankrupt. I mean, in some ways, I feel like the idea is not bankrupt at all, and that's why people are here tonight, is because we understand that these basic ideas about representation for all and everybody having an equal voice and being able to have a direct connection to the people who are making decisions that affect your life, that these things really matter and that everybody should have equal capacity to do that, and that that's what makes a world, you know, a civil society. So the question is, how do we make the institutions we've got come up to speed? So it sounds like we've come to a beautiful resolution. And I'm now going to turn it over to all of you.
Thank you, and thank you for the points that have been made already. It seems to me, while sitting and listening to you, that one of the problems that I perceive as causing the current level of disengagement and disillusionment with our federal, particularly our federal and state governments, is the influence of the major parties. Now, what does the panel think about the way that the major parties are formulating their policies and their actions? Because it seems to me that both of them are merely representing a small bunch of vested interests.
Okay.
I wonder whether we might forsake what traditionally has been perceived as a benefit of political parties, that is stability of government. We know what happened to Italy after the war, where they didn't have sort of any proper structure and they were continually changing governments. We just continually change leaders. But it's a difficult issue. But New Zealand have gone to proportional representation in their parliament, in the lower house.
Okay, so I'm just going to, I'm conscious of the long queue behind you, so the question I think was a really good one.
And they haven't fallen to pieces.
Yes, so it's about political parties. Who would like to answer?
I'm happy to kick it off if you like. I mean, look, in some respects it's a hypothetical question, because you're not going to get rid of political parties out of our political system, or any advanced democratic system for that matter. It's because people who run for election to parliaments and people who serve inside parliaments come to the rational conclusion that by trading off some of their independence and forming groups with others, they actually can form majorities and get things done. And so you're just not going to be able to get them out of the system. That said, I certainly think there's scope for reform that could make the party system work better. You know, for example, I think that politicians or members of parties should be given more freedom to vote independently in Parliament, and not be strictly bound to follow the party line. And I also think there's some reforms that could be made around democratising our political parties, which would create a better system as well.
Okay, now the exciting news is I've got Samar back on the screen. Hi.
Hello.
How are you?
Good,
so look,
good.
we're taking questions, but you are now in the mix to answer some of them. So I know we didn't get a chance to really hear Samar speak about her views, but I will introduce her, and then you will know that she's also available to answer questions. So Samar is the person who I'm going to introduce in a microsecond when I read this. She is an Arab-Australian human rights campaigner who's worked as an international advocate with Oxfam International, the Globally Poverty Project, Global Citizen, and the UN. She's currently based in Lebanon, where she is building active citizen platforms for those affected by conflict and poverty. So she's also available amongst the panel to answer. You're up on the screen, Samar.
Wonderful.
Terrific. So did anyone else want to have a bite at that cherry? We're talking about political parties at the moment.
I'm just going to make just one comment, recognising that I'm not a partisan. On politics, I'm apolitical, but I'm not going to make a comment about the parties themselves. But I'm going to comment, I think, a little bit on the rise of the alternative political party away from the mainstream. And we are seeing the electorate move away from the traditional kind of left versus right. You're looking at the Greens, you're looking at the micro parties, and it seems to me that there is a sense in the electorate about wanting to search for an alternative, because perhaps coming a little bit closer towards the centre, although there are some very clear differences between the two, I think.
Yes. Okay. Sir.
I'll put a question for Samara, is it?
Terrific.
We're talking about political parties in Australia. An issue that I presume that you're right up with is the problem with accepting refugees to Australia. And
Yep.
within that issue, we have our political system has come to the position where, because the two major parties both have similar, rather horrible policies in relation to this, we have had a protracted time of no action and people in detention being worse and worse off. Do you think that this is a problem with our political system? And as a person with broader international views, how do you think we Australians should be doing, what we should be doing about it, if anything?
Great question.
It's a really good question, and I'm currently living in a country that has over 1 million refugees with the entire population of 4 million people. So certainly the world is facing a refugee crisis, and that really puts things in perspective when you look at the conflicts and the debates in Australia around us trying to accept 1,000 few asylum seekers. I'd say that there is a crisis in confidence when it comes to the political system working on issues like this. I've worked on, the refugee and asylum seeker issue in Australia for many, many years now. And I have to say that, unfortunately, I think that the political parties are reflecting, to a certain extent, popular opinion on this issue. And I don't say that lightly. I think that there is amongst the electorate a sense of fear, and some of that is xenophobia around accepting people from different parts of the world, particularly from the Middle East and Africa, into Australia. And I'd say that on an issue like this, where the majority opinion is not so much in line with where we should be, and how we should be playing our role as a global citizen, I think that's where it comes down to moral leadership, and for our political leaders to really take a stand and step up and really enact policies that, while might be unpopular, do work in our long-term interests as as part of the global community. But I'd say, on the broader issue, for issues like this of human rights or social justice, as someone who has grown up in a minority in Australia, I don't feel like our political system or our formal politics in itself is representative of the people that I grew up with, or the multicultural Australia that I know, or certainly our demographics. And I think there is, as mentioned previously, a disconnect between how people are feeling and the change they want to see, and our ruling institutions. So I'd say that, diversity, cultural diversity, gender diversity is so needed in our formal political system, in order for us to enact more fair and just policies for the country.
Thank you for that. Here. Okay, sir, and can we ask, just because I'm conscious everybody wants a turn, can we just keep the questions really short and sharp?
Yes, my name's Ken Kogel, former Member of Parliament and Speaker, and now an Associate Professor at Monash University. A number of the suggestions that have been made are really about empowerment and about deliberation, as distinct from simply putting a question up and asking people to vote or one in favour of others. And I suggested that may be why you got the result you did to the show of hands. But there are other models in addition to citizens' juries which have been very successful. And one of the best examples is the use of participatory budgeting in Brazilian cities. And there's a recent study showing superior social outcomes for cities which have used participatory budgeting compared to Brazilian cities which have not used it. So I think there is something to be learned from cases such as that. But so far as what's happening in Australia is concerned, it's in some ways distressing that Eleanor McTiernan has announced her resignation from the federal parliament, because when she was Minister for Planning in Western Australia over 7 years, she made very good use of these deliberative processes and got much better results than would have been the case simply relying on politicians or even public servants, dare I say. So I think that says something about the nature of parliamentary parties in Australia, where someone of Alana's obvious talent and experience is sidelined in the federal caucus, and it's not as if it's something that only happens on one side of politics.
So can I jump in here, because I think participatory democracy is a really, participatory budgeting is a really interesting idea. Does anyone want to jump in and talk a little bit about that as another way that we can refresh and innovate around democracy?
You can take participatory budgeting at a number of levels. I'm going to go back to a conversation that you had earlier. Yes, you can have systemic participatory budgeting, as in the budgeting of a city, but you can also flow down right through at an individual level. And it's this notion of co-design, co-creation, co-production, where instead of government doing something to you, so say, Leslie, you're entitled to a bundle of services, instead of me as government telling you, here's the services, I'm going to give you those, I've assessed those as being best for you, I'm going to give you the equivalent and say, really the premise of the National Disability Insurance Scheme is to say, here's an entitlement, here's $500, $1,000, $2,000, whatever your services were worth. Here's your own individualised personal service budget. You spend the money as you see fit. So in some ways, it's that micro version of something more macro. Travis is waving his finger.
I was just going to say that on the kind of broadening the budgetary aspects of the deliberative process, I think if ever it's needed now. One thing our new Secretary of Prime Minister and Cabinet, Martin Parkinson, said 5 years ago when he was Treasury Secretary was that the most important policy vector of this generation was sustainability. And the most important question was what stock of capital, broadly defined, natural, social, environmental, economic, should each generation bequeath to the next. Currently in Australia, at least federally, our spending is, I think, 26.1% of GDP, and our tax to GDP revenue at the moment is about 21.8%. Both major parties have set a target of 23.9%, but there is a 4% gap. And the big question that's not being asked in the budgetary deliberations is what do people expect of government, right? What sort of growth do people want? What stock of capital should be bequeathed? And so it's exactly the sort of analysis that should be subject to more deliberative processes and not be as secretive as sometimes the budgetary process can be. But I agree with you entirely on Alana McTiernan. I'm a West Australian, and it's a real shame to see real talent, whether it's on the right or the left, give up because the system sucks the life out of them.
It is a shame. Go right ahead.
I saw the movie The Rise and Fall of Michael Rimmel, but we don't want to do that. But just
just so everybody knows, it's a 1970s British comedy about a young man who is very up and coming and manages to become a very successful politician who manages to convince everybody that he should be a dictator, I believe.
Well, everybody got a chance to vote on everything. So it was on your TV was a blue flashing light, so you're right in the middle of doing dishes, and next thing the blue flashing light came on. And had to go and vote, so they did it over and over, and in the end everybody was sick of, they did it too much.
They were sick of participating, so they decided to turn it back over, which I think is an argument that in a movie way they were making up here before.
But I don't think we'd get to that. But, you know, companies launching a product, they have focus groups, you know, what do you like about it, what colour, etc., etc. So what I'm getting at, and I've got two examples, is one, I'd like to have a say on this coal seam gas, the fracking. And thank God, and thank Dan the man, we've got a moratorium here in Victoria. We're not allowing it at the moment. But up in Queensland, it's open slather, and I think the Condamine River is bubbling away with methane gas right now as we speak. And that river empties out at Lake Eyre in South Australia. I think we're going to have such a problem with water, poisoned water in this country, that we'll have none left. And I just want
So those are the issues you care about, and is what you're saying that for the issues you care about, you'd really like to have an opportunity to participate.
But I think the general public have got no idea, and I'll take one more step with the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I don't know how many people here know about that, but that was signed in secret. And we wouldn't have known anything about it if it wasn't for Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, you know, so the politicians are doing things behind our backs that are not good for us. And for me, the main point is we have to be educated. We have to be educated what's going on.
Absolutely. Samar wants to make a comment. Go ahead.
Just to add to the coal seam gas issue, which is a really important model for organising. You know, this has been an issue, environmental issue, that has inspired a lot of young people in Australia to start organising locally and organise protests within their local communities against the fracking, practice of fracking in certain areas and parts of Australia. And they've been rather successful in trying to get local communities on board this issue. And I think it's one that reflects the need to work locally. As we see that, yes, issues have become more global in nature, I think that our ability to change these issues and influence decisions around these issues remain local. And it shows the effectiveness of local participation and local organising and the need to build around that, you know, awareness in your own communities and trying to get people to participate, whether in protest movements or otherwise, around these issues. So I definitely see the role of, you know, local community organising and local councils as well as a really important one, even if our world is becoming far more globalised.
And how can we get people engaged?
Well, I think this is where technology can come into it, actually. So I think what the previous the previous questioner raised and what has just been said now is the difference between, yes, okay, so you've got the decision-making process and can we contribute to decisions? Decisions are made, but then how do we scrutinise those decisions and how do we voice opinions against those decisions? And if you're thinking about protests and making voices heard, this is where I think digital media has a role to play in amplifying voice. I think you only have to look at the success of organisations such as Get Up, for example, in being able to mobilise people quickly, and other parallels that to a certain extent they're the 21st century version of the placard, if you like, in terms of the scrutiny and the questioning of a decision. And I think that that's what the connectivity does.
Something about what she was saying to me is really speaking to, I guess, the feeling that, you know, the Michael Rimmer example, okay, maybe we don't want to participate in every decision. We don't have time, we're too busy, we don't have the expertise. But at the same time, there's some issues that people feel really passionately about. They're probably pretty informed, or they'd certainly be happy to get that way. Is there some way that we can balance that? I mean, how do we rope in and co-create and, you know, mix in people who are so passionate and interested in a particular issue, whatever the issue is?
I think that's where you get to the role of non-government organisations, about adding your voice to other voices so that you can be heard as an individual. You can find somewhere where your voice can be heard and amplified and being kind of put forward.
So you don't think that really new democratic governance structures are required around trying to take more advantage of informed and enthusiastic and energised citizens? It really is, we've got the systems for that, you just need to get
You can,
up
but
and
then there
go
comes
and
a
do
point
stuff.
where do I want to exercise my voice and my views so much that I want to make the shift from being a citizen to actually being a legislator, to standing for parliament, to standing for local council?
Look, I think you've got to think very carefully about your institutional design. So I'm all for us thinking about new ways of experimenting with democracy, but I also think you need to have some carefully thought through checks and balances in place. So, you know, when I spoke earlier about Australia, or the Australian colonies in the 1850s, having the most democratic lower houses, legislative assemblies in the world, they were countenanced, if you like, by upper houses, which still gave preference to the landed gentry, if you like, and so there was, and that was seen as a way of helping to get permission from the people who had the power to make some of these democratic reforms. Similarly, when the Australian Federal Parliament was established, the Senate was seen as being a state's house. Quite undemocratic, but why was that done? It was so that the colonies weren't seen to be losing all of their power. I think one of the traps we can fall into when we talk about democratic reform is thinking that if we had more democracy than all our pet grievances, you know, whether it's climate change or coal seam gas or refugee intake, that more democracy will solve those things. I suspect, for example, if you looked at Finland right now, where I gave the example of marriage equality earlier, I suspect you'll see some things coming forward around perhaps shutting the borders to taking in refugees, reflecting community concern around that. So I really make these points simply to say that you've got to think carefully about your institutional design.
And also social divisions are going to exist however you design the system.
Exactly right. Like. And there's no perfect solution. There is absolutely not. So you've got to get the design right and balance up these competing things.
Okay.
My name's Dr. Julia Thornton. I'm a member of the Victorian Fabians Executive here in Melbourne. I'm going to bring up Brazil too. My question goes to cultures of democracy. Last year, my husband and I were in Brazil, and we were in actually Brasilia, where the parliament is, and we were there for about a week, and the whole time we were there were demonstrations with loads of young people in a very participatory way in and around the parliament. Nothing unusual about that. What was unusual was that all of the demonstration infrastructure, the marquees, the portable toilets and all of those kind of things were provided by the parliament. The other unusual thing about it was that the parliament itself let the demonstrators in. In fact, I have a movie on my phone of the demonstrators dancing en masse in the parliament. So this is clearly a country, if it doesn't have a sort of total culture of democracy, it has the bones of a democracy. So the question is, why is it like that? And we were told the demonstrators are treated like this because it's in the Constitution. Why is it in the Constitution? Because they had the generals, okay? It was a huge democratic reaction to a crisis. So my question is, does it take a crisis to move a culture?
Good question. Samar, do you have a view about that? Does it take a crisis to move a culture?
Well, I think certainly based on my experience in the Middle East during the Arab uprisings, or otherwise known as the Arab Spring, certainly it did take a crisis to move millions of people, millions of otherwise, I wouldn't say apathetic, but fearful citizens to take to the streets and demand their freedoms. You know, for many, many years, Arabs living in the Middle East have been ruled by corrupt, dictatorial military regimes that have denied their basic rights and voices. And so certainly I think the Arab Spring was sparked by various moments of crises, but it was, you know, a long time in the making. And it did spur on millions of people from different backgrounds, from different sectors of society to converge on the streets and demand their freedoms. They weren't necessarily demanding democracy in the way that we expected or imagine it in the Australian context or in advanced societies, but certainly they were demanding accountability, transparency, the right to be heard, and the right for them to hold their leaders to account. So I'd say that, you know, that moment of protest, that historical moment, was a really unique one for the Middle East region. And I think that it is spreading to different parts of the world, as we saw in the case of Brazil. I mean, I don't know if we can say, though, you know, that these certain countries are on their way to democracy because they allowed a protest to take place. I think, as we saw in the Arab region, protest movements don't necessarily lead to democratic movements or democratic changes. But certainly I think that we will see more protests in different forms across the world because people are increasingly feeling as though their voices are being stifled.
I know you probably have something to say about this, but we haven't.
I want to have a crack at the crisis question.
I know you do. And I normally would throw to you. I just feel like I need to try to get through some of the questions. We've only got 5 minutes. Sorry. Afterwards, speak to this man. Go. Short and sharp so other people can have a go.
Sorry,
Yep.
I'll try and make it very short. My name's Sally Marsden, and in the last couple of days, there's been a couple of examples of crowdfunding that have been amazing, and one was around the same-sex and gender diverse formal, and one was about taking victim survivors of sexual abuse to Rome, and they both almost overnight made more than their aim, and it felt like a real visceral sort of way of people making a practical protest about people that hold great power and thumb their nose at us, like the Catholic Church and George Pell and the federal government. And I'm just wondering if you think that, as well as outsourcing sort of policy, that crowdfunding might be a way that people will have a direct way of participating.
Maria, you have something to say about crowdfunding?
I absolutely agree. It's another way of expressing interest, of demonstrating against a counter view. I've been really interested to see the issue that you've raised. For those people who don't know, it's about the same-sex formal for under 18s. There's been some talk about protest from fundamentalist groups. In turn, people can buy a ticket for kids to go and attend the same-sex formal, and they raise double, as you said, their money. And so it's a way of saying, I don't agree with this prevailing view over here. I'm going to put my money where my mouth is, which in some ways I think is easier than ticking the box on a collectivism kind of petition to a certain extent.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you for that question. Sir, short and sharp.
This is the good side over here, I think. Does it take a crisis to move democracy along? So I'm following that theme a little bit, as it turns out. But it's such a young panel. Ta-da! And I was young once, and a lot of the audience were once too.
Still are.
I was young once.
And which brings me to my point. When I was young, we were fired up. La Trobe University, we had blokes in Pentridge Jail. Do you remember all that? I remember at the wall, I had my little Anglia there, we had a huge loudspeaker on the roof, talked to the boys on the other side. The guards came out, they grabbed the handles of the car, we looked in the mirror, we saw them tumbling in the background. It was exciting times. We were fired up because we had the apartheid demonstrations. When we arrived in Sydney in the buses, they said the Maddies from Melbourne are here. We had the Vietnam thing, the Palestine, student democracy itself. And bugger it, I'm not so fired up now. And I think maybe the question is, perhaps we are a sort of a content outfit here in Australia, and apart from the Eureka thing, we've never really had to do any in the ditch fighting and struggling with oppressed bastards and all the rest of it, although we came from Europe after the war and we're both people and we've made it here. So I guess when we came out, we had to sort of Father was a second-hand dealer. We used to give a lot of silver at the borders over to Italy and then over on the ship. But anyway, I'm just saying the question is, are we too content now? And have we had no real struggles and fights recently? Eureka, maybe.
Okay, Travis, I'm going to get you to have a go because you haven't had much of a chance.
Well, yeah, I agree with the questioner. We are content. We've had 26 years almost of uninterrupted economic growth. We didn't suffer, dramatically from the Great Recession in 2009, unlike most of Europe and North America and others. And we have, we're called the lucky country for a reason. And that, I think, has bred a sort of content about resting on our laurels to some extent for the crises that are hidden, that aren't burning. But we know enough about their probability that they will be alive, clear and present dangers, much faster than we expect. We could go on about which crises may be hidden but not part of the public debate. But I do think that we have been a little bit too content. And that's why, as Nick alluded to earlier, we used to be at the front of the pack on leading some of these movements, although the Kiwis were always ahead of us. I've got to say that because my wife's a Kiwi. But we've gone to the back of the pack on too many of these.
And I'm going to ask Samar, you're going to have our final comment tonight, Samar. What do you think? Is everybody too content, or are there some parts of Australia society that are far from content and complacent?
Well, I'd say that this is where the tyranny of the majority comes into it. for the majority of Australians, sure, Australia is a great country to live in. We're not facing major crises at the moment, but there are numerous Australians, millions of Australians, who are living in below standard conditions, facing discrimination, institutional injustice. Our Indigenous population at the moment is facing major crises. Minorities in our country are facing major crises. We have vulnerable parts of our community in our country that don't feel content, aren't fulfilled, don't feel as though their rights are being promoted and protected by our elites or our institutions. So I think that when it comes to discussing the idea of democracy, we can't let the majority view necessarily form our opinion around the state of our country. I think that we need to look at those that are unheard, the voices of the minority and those that are vulnerable, to really start building a society that is far more inclusive, far more diverse and fair.
That, I think, is a really terrific way to end. So can I just get you to keep clapping and thank our guests, please. Thank Nicholas Rees, thank Travis McLeod, thank Maria Katsonis, and thank Summer Hadid. And thanks a lot.